Iron Ridge courtyard was thick with the scent of expensive leather and cold, predatory power. Debra stood at the very end of the line, her fingers twitching against the rough fabric of her soot-stained tunic. To her left, her sister, Calla, stood like a statue of marble and silk, her golden hair catching the light as she cast a look of pure loathing at Debra. "Try not to breathe too loudly, Runt," Calla hissed, her voice a razor-thin whisper. "The king doesn't like the smell of grease and failure." Debra didn't answer. She couldn't. The weight was back. That strange, crushing density in the air that only she seemed to feel. It had been pressing down on her since the royal carriage crested the ridge, a phantom pressure that made her shadows seem deeper, darker, and more alive than they should be. Then, King Jayden stepped out. He was a creature of sharp angles and starlit eyes, his presence so overwhelming that the high-ranking alphas of Iron Ridge instinctively bared their throats. He moved past the line of shimmering, perfumed omegas with a look of bored disdain until he reached the end. His gaze snagged on Debra. It wasn't love that sparked in his stormy gray eyes, but a cruel curiosity. "This one," Jayden commanded, his voice a low vibration that made the ground beneath Debra's feet shudder. "She has the look of something that needs to be broken." The blood moon ritual that followed was a nightmare of fire and rejection. Standing on the sacred dais, Jayden's hand hovered over Debra's heart. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the bond to snap. Instead, Jayden pulled away with a sneer of disgust. "There is nothing inside her," he roared, his voice carrying to the furthest reaches of the Packlands. "A hollow vessel. I reject this pathetic offering. Throw her to the borderlands. Let the rogues have the scraps." As the guards stepped forward to seize her, the world turned bone-chillingly cold. The torches flickered and died. From the very shadow Debra cast on the stone, a pair of violet eyes opened. A massive, ethereal paw of smoke and starlight slammed into the dais, and a roar that sounded like the earth itself breaking open forced King Jayden to his knees for the first time in his life. The Guardian had arrived. The silence that followed the Guardian's roar was more deafening than the sound itself. King Jayden remained on his knees, his palms pressed against the cold stone of the dais, his breath hitching in his throat. He looked up, his starlit eyes wide with a mixture of primal terror and an obsessive, burgeoning wonder. The entity looming over Debra wasn't a wolf of flesh and bone. It was a nightmare woven from the void, a translucent behemoth of shifting smoke and violet embers that seemed to swallow the moonlight. "Stay back!" Calla shrieked, scrambling away from her sister as if Debra were a plague-bearer. Her golden silk dress was ruined, dragging through the soot, but she didn't care. The runt she had spent 19 years kicking was now the epicenter of a power that made the very air hum with lethal electricity. The pack guards, driven by a lifetime of blind obedience to the crown, recovered first. Their lead beta, a man named Harkan, drew his silver-edged blade. "It's a trick! A witch's illusion!" he barked, though his voice wavered. "Seize the Omega! Carry out the king's decree!" As 3 guards lunged forward with iron shackles, Debra didn't move. She didn't have to. She felt the Guardian's presence behind her like a wall of living ice. The spectral wolf didn't bite. It simply exhaled. A wave of concussive force, cold as a winter grave, blasted outward. The guards were tossed back like dried leaves in a hurricane, their armor clattering against the stone pillars. "Enough!" Jayden's voice finally broke through the chaos, though it lacked its usual edge of tyranny. He stood slowly, his legs still trembling from the involuntary submission the beast had forced upon him. He ignored his advisors and the sobbing Calla, his focus entirely on the small, soot-stained girl standing in the center of the devastation. Debra's eyes, normally a soft, frightened brown, were now swirling with the same violet fire as the Guardian. She looked at the king, the man who had just called her a hollow vessel, and for the first time in her life, She didn't feel the urge to hide. "You rejected me," she whispered, her voice carrying an ancient, echoing weight. Jayden took a step toward her, his hand reaching out, but the guardian lowered its massive, smoky head and let out a low, vibrating growl that cracked the marble beneath the king's boots. The message was clear. The king had lost his right to touch the anchor. He had banished the girl, and in doing so, he had banished his own salvation. "I was wrong," Jayden murmured, the words tasting like ash. But as the guardian began to fade back into Debra's shadow, taking the light with it, the king realized the true horror of his mistake. The borderlands were a death sentence, and he had just sent a deity into the jaws of the rogues. The borderlands were a jagged scar of dead trees and obsidian rock, a place where the moon goddess's light rarely touched. King Jayden tore through the underbrush, his regal cloak snagging on thorns, his lungs burning with the sharp metallic air of the rogue territories. Behind him, his elite guards struggled to keep pace, but Jayden didn't wait. The scent of milk, honey, and that terrifying ozone from the Guardian was fading, and the thought of Debra alone in this wasteland made his beast howl in a way it never had before. He found her in a clearing where the trees had been leveled as if by a localized storm. Debra lay curled on the frozen ground, her small frame shivering violently. She looked fragile. A girl broken by the weight of a power she didn't understand and a rejection she didn't deserve. But she wasn't alone. As Jayden stepped into the clearing, the shadows didn't rise this time. Instead, the very air began to shimmer with a pale, celestial light. A wolf made of pure, liquid starlight materialized over her. It was smaller than the shadow beast from the ritual, but its presence was infinitely more radiant. Its fur moved like the aurora borealis, and its eyes were twin galaxies of swirling gold. Jayden stopped, his hands raised in an instinctive gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt her," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I came to bring her back." The starlight wolf tilted its head, its translucent body pulsing with a low hum. It stepped over Debra, placing a protective paw near her head. Jayden felt a mental pressure, a cold, clinical assessment of his soul. The Guardian was looking past his crown, past his strength, and into the dark, arrogant corners of his heart where he had decided an Omega's life was worth nothing. "I know I don't deserve her," Jayden admitted to the silent beast, sinking slowly to his knees in the mud. The pride that had defined his reign for a decade shattered. "But the rogues are coming. The Eclipse sect is moving. She won't survive the night without my steel, and I won't survive the rest of my life knowing I let her die." The Guardian didn't move for a long moment. Then, with a sigh that sounded like the wind through ancient pines, the starlight began to dim. The wolf lowered its head, nuzzling Debra's cheek before dissolving into a fine mist that settled over her like a warm blanket. Jayden rushed forward, gathering Debra into his arms. She was ice cold, her skin glowing with a faint pearlescent sheen. As he tucked her head against his chest, her eyes fluttered open for a brief second. "Jayden?" she breathed, her voice barely a thread. "I have you, Debra," he murmured, pressing his forehead against hers. "I have you, and I am never letting go again." The gold-leafed gates of the royal palace groaned as King Jayden strode through, his boots caked in the mud of the borderlands. He ignored the gasps of the servants and the frantic whispering of the courtiers as they took in the sight of their sovereign, bloodied and disheveled, carrying the unconscious Omega wrapped in his own royal furs. By the time he reached the Great Hall, the Council of Elders was already waiting. 7 men and women in heavy obsidian robes stood in a semicircle, their faces etched with a severity that matched the cold stone walls. "You bring a curse into these halls, Jayden?" Elder Hestia spoke, her voice echoing like a death knell. The girl was banished. By your own word, she was declared a hollow vessel. To bring her back, especially after that manifestation, is a violation of every law our ancestors bled to write. Jayden didn't stop. He walked past them toward the royal wing, his grip on Debra tightening. The laws were written for wolves. He threw over his shoulder, his voice dangerously low. What I saw in that clearing was something far older than our laws. It is witchcraft, a younger alpha from the council barked, stepping into Jayden's path. She is an anchor for a demon, nothing more. The court is in an uproar. Your own people fear that you have been ensnared by a siren's spell. If you do not hand her over to the Inquisitors for study, you risk a coup before the sun sets. Jayden stopped then. He slowly turned his head, his eyes flashing with a predatory starlight that made the council members recoil. The air around him began to drop in temperature, a phantom frost creeping across the polished floors. The next person who calls her a demon, Jayden whispered, will find out exactly how much study my claws can perform on a human throat. She is under my personal protection. She is not a prisoner, she is not an experiment, and she is certainly not a runt anymore. He reached the heavy doors of his private chambers and kicked them open. Clear the infirmary. Bring the best healers, but tell them this. If they so much as scratch her skin, I will burn their lineages to ash. The council is dismissed. As the doors slammed shut, Jayden carefully laid Debra on the massive bed. She looked so small against the dark silk sheets, her face still pale as marble. The palace was vibrating with the tension of 1,000 angry wolves outside. But inside this room, Jayden only felt one thing, the terrifying, desperate need for her to wake up and tell him that he wasn't too late to be forgiven. Debra woke not to the smell of soot and grease, but to the intoxicating aroma of sandalwood and a warmth that felt like a summer afternoon. For a moment, she thought she was dead, but the soft ache in her limbs reminded her she was very much alive. She opened her eyes to find a ceiling carved from dark oak and gold, but as she blinked, the physical world began to blur. Everything was draped in light. She could see shimmering, translucent ribbons of energy pulsing through the walls, connecting every living thing in the palace. When she looked at her own hands, a faint violet glow hummed beneath her skin, the spirit threads of the guardian woven into her very marrow. "You're awake," a voice rumbled from the shadows. Jayden sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, his face shadowed by exhaustion. To Debra's new sight, the king was a storm of jagged, pulsing red and deep navy energy. But as he stood and moved toward her, she saw something that made her heart stop. Tangled within his brilliant aura were black, necrotic veins, a curse that was slowly strangling his life force. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice sounding hollow as if two people were speaking at once. "The Northern Palace. You're safe?" Debra. Jayden reached out but hesitated, his fingers hovering inches from her cheek. Debra sat up, the silk sheets sliding off her shoulders. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached out and grasped his wrist. The moment they touched, a spark of violet light jumped between them. Through the thread of the guardian, she felt his pain, the biting frost of an ancient lineage curse that was eating him from the inside out. "You're dying," she said, her violet-swirled eyes locking onto his. Jayden stiffened, his breath hitching. "It is a shadow on the royal bloodline, a price we pay for our strength. No healer has ever been able to see it, let alone touch it." "The Guardian sees it," Debra murmured. She could feel the spectral wolf stirring in the depths of her soul, not with rage this time, but with a low, medicinal hum. "My wolf." "It isn't just a shield, Jayden. It's the cure. But you didn't want a cure. You wanted a trophy." Jayden dropped his head, his shoulders slumped in a way no subject had ever seen. "I wanted what I was told an alpha should want. I was blind, Debra. I saw a girl without a wolf and thought you were empty. I didn't realize you were the only thing in this world that was actually full." Outside the heavy oak doors, Debra could hear the spirit threads of the courtiers vibrating with malice. Their energies were sharp, yellow spikes of jealousy and fear. She realized then that she wasn't just a girl anymore. She was a window into the truth, and the truth was about to make her the most hunted woman in the kingdom. The iron-shod hooves of 100 war stallions rang out against the palace cobblestones, a rhythmic drumming that signaled the arrival of trouble. Alpha Silas of the Stormclaw pack didn't wait for an invitation. He dismounted with a fluid, predatory grace, his mismatched eyes, one blue, one amber, scanning the palace windows until they landed on the royal wing. Inside the throne room, the air was static with tension. Jayden stood before the great hearth, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, while Debra sat tucked in the shadows of the mezzanine, watching the spirit threads of the newcomers. Silas's energy was a roiling, toxic lime green, the color of ambition curdled into greed. "I hear the king of all alphas has developed a taste for ghosts," Silas drawled as he entered, his voice like grinding stones. He didn't bow. Instead, he signaled his men to fan out. "The rumors say you've taken a wolfless runt into your bed, Jayden, and that she carries a shadow beast capable of toppling thrones." "Choose your next words carefully, Silas," Jayden warned, the black veins of his curse pulsing faintly beneath the skin of his neck. "You are standing in my house." "Your house is built on a lie," Silas countered, his eyes flashing. "The laws of the great hunt state that if a king is unfit, if he is cursed or compromised, his assets are open for challenge. I'm not here for your crown, Jayden. Not yet. I'm here for the girl." Debra felt the guardian stir within her, a cold, sharp blade of violet light extending from her chest toward the intruder. Silas felt it too. He flinched, his amber eye twitching. "She isn't an asset," Jayden growled, stepping forward. "She's a weapon," Silas corrected. "And in your hands, she's a waste. I challenge you, King Jayden, to a duel of ownership. According to the old code, if you cannot defend your claim, she belongs to the Stormclaws. Or perhaps," Silas sneered, looking up at the mezzanine where Debra sat, "the girl would prefer a master who actually knows what she is worth, instead of one who tried to leave her for the crows." Jayden's wolf surged to the surface, his pupils bleeding into black. The challenge had been issued, and in the world of alphas there was no turning back. If he refused, the council would use his cowardice to strip him of his title. If he fought, he risked unleashing the very curse that was killing him. From her perch, Debra saw the threads of fate tightening around them both. Silas wasn't just a rival. He was a shark who had smelled blood in the water. The altar of the ancient kings was a circular pit of white sand surrounded by towering monoliths that hummed with the history of 1,000 wars. Thousands of wolves lined the ridges, their eyes glowing in the twilight, waiting for a king to fall or a weapon to be won. In the center of the pit, Jayden stood stripped to the waist. The black veins of the curse were visible now, a spider web of necrotic ink stretching from his heart to his throat. Across from him, Silas grinned, hefting a massive claymore that shimmered with a sickly, iridescent light. "Is that the scent of rot I smell, Jayden?" Silas mocked, circling like a shark. "The crown is getting heavy." From her seat on the high dais, Debra clutched the arms of her chair. She could see the spirit threads of the arena. They were fraying. Jayden's energy was a flickering candle, while Silas's was a jagged saw of lime-green malice. The duel began with a sound like a thunderclap. Silas was fast, but Jayden fought with the desperation of a man who had finally found something worth living for. They collided in a blur of steel and fur, the shockwaves of their blows rattling the monoliths. But as the fight wore on, Jayden's movements slowed. He coughed, a spray of dark blood hitting the white sand. "Now," Silas hissed. He pivoted, pulling a hidden dagger from his belt, a blade laced with liquid silver and ground wolfsbane. "No!" Debra screamed, standing up. The dagger found its mark, sinking into Jayden's shoulder. The king collapsed. A roar of agony ripped from his throat as the silver burned through his veins, reacting violently with the curse already in his blood. Silas stood over him, the claymore raised for the killing blow. "She belongs to the Stormclaws now." But the blade never fell. The air in the arena didn't just turn cold, it vanished. Debra felt her heart stop, and in that silence, a voice that wasn't hers whispered, "Enough." Violet lightning arched from the mezzanine to the center of the pit. Debra didn't jump. She drifted, her feet barely touching the sand as she descended. Her hair was a halo of white fire, and her eyes were no longer human. They were twin voids of violet starlight. The guardian wolf didn't appear behind her this time. It emerged through her. Debra's skin took on a pearlescent metallic sheen. As Silas swung his claymore at her in a panic, she simply raised a hand. The massive steel blade shattered into 1,000 shards upon contact with her aura. She didn't strike him. She merely looked at him, and the sheer weight of her presence slammed Silas into the sand, the ground beneath him cracking into a crater. The girl who had been mocked as a wolfless runt now stood as a goddess of war, her violet gaze turning toward the fallen king. The stadium was a tomb of silence, broken only by the crackle of violet static dancing across the sand. Debra stood in the center of the crater, her presence so immense that the physical world seemed to warp around her. Alpha Silas lay pinned to the earth by an invisible weight, his bones groaning under the pressure of a goddess's gaze. Every other wolf in the stands, thousands of warriors, elders, and commoners, found their legs giving way. An ancient primal instinct was screaming at them. The source is here. Jayden lay a few feet away, the silver poison and the black curse fighting for dominance in his veins. He looked up, his vision blurred by pain, and saw not the scullery maid he had mocked, nor the Omega he had tried to protect. He saw the end and the beginning. Debra turned her head, the violet voids of her eyes fixed on the fallen king. She didn't speak, but her voice echoed directly into the minds of every soul present. "You searched for a weapon to tame," the voice resonated, vibrating in their very marrow. "But you have only ever been the dust beneath its paws." Slowly, Debra walked toward Jayden. With every step, the silver poison in his shoulder began to smoke, turning from toxic black to a harmless white mist. The necrotic veins on his neck receded, scorched away by the sheer purity of her aura. Jayden felt the agony vanish, replaced by a warmth so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He realized then that he had spent his entire life trying to be a king of men, while the woman before him was the queen of the stars. He didn't wait for a command. He didn't check to see who was watching. King Jayden, the most feared alpha of the northern territories, pushed himself up from the sand and moved into a deep ceremonial kowtow. He pressed his forehead into the dirt at Debra's feet, his neck exposed, the ultimate gesture of submission for a wolf. "I do not ask for your crown," Jayden whispered, his voice carried by the wind to the furthest reaches of the stadium. "I ask only to be the first to serve the light I was too blind to see. My life, my pack, and my soul belong to the anchor. One by one, like a field of wheat caught in a gale." The thousands of wolves in the stands followed suit. They dropped from their seats, kneeling in the aisles, their heads bowed in a collective act of worship. The wolfless Omega had achieved in seconds what centuries of war had failed to do. She had united the packs under a single divine truth. Debra reached down, her shimmering fingers brushing Jayden's hair. The possession began to soften, the violet fire in her eyes receding to a gentle glow. She was still Debra, but she was also something more. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the power. She was the power. The peace of the submission was shattered not by a roar, but by a chilling, rhythmic chanting that seemed to rise from the very earth. From the shadows of the arena's monoliths, figures draped in bone-white robes emerged, the Eclipse sect. They were the keepers of the ancient rot, the ones who had fed Jayden's ancestors the curse to ensure the royal line remained dependent on their dark alchemy. "The anchor must fall!" the high priest Valerius shrieked, his voice cracking like dry parchment. He raised a staff topped with a pulsating black crystal. "She is a herald of the old gods. If she lives, the age of the Alpha is over." As if on cue, the sky above the stadium turned an unnatural, bruised purple. Arrows tipped with shadow fire rained down, targeting the huddled masses in the stands. The wolves, still recovering from the psychic shock of Debra's manifestation, scrambled to defend themselves. But the fire didn't burn flesh. It burned the soul, leaving the warriors screaming in phantom agony. Jayden surged to his feet, his newly healed body pulsing with a strength he hadn't felt in a decade. He stood in front of Debra, his claws extending. "Stay behind me!" he barked, though he knew she was far more dangerous than he was. "No," Debra said, her voice calm and terrifying. She stepped beside him, her hand finding his. "We do this together. Your steel, my light." The sect's elite voidwalkers lunged into the pit, their forms flickering in and out of existence. They were immune to physical strikes, their bodies turning to smoke whenever Jayden's claws swung through them. "They aren't physical, Jayden!" Debra shouted. She closed her eyes, reaching deep into the reservoir of the Guardian. "Channel your rage into the bond! Give the shadow a shape!" She gripped his hand tighter, and a surge of violet electricity flowed from her palm into his arm. Jayden's silver-blue aura fused with her starlight, coating his claws in a shimmering violet flame. The next time a Voidwalker lunged, Jayden didn't miss. His strike connected with a sickening crunch of spiritual energy, shattering the assassin into a cloud of harmless mist. Valerius, seeing his elite guard decimated, slammed his staff into the sand. A shockwave of pure necrotic energy surged toward the center of the pit. Debra stepped forward, letting go of Jayden's hand. She raised both arms, and the guardian wolf didn't just appear. It exploded outward in a dome of blinding radiance. The necrotic wave hit the shield and disintegrated. Debra's hair whipped around her face as she channeled the full weight of the Argentum lineage. "You fed on the darkness of this world for long enough," she declared, her eyes glowing like twin sun. She slammed her palms together. A pillar of violet light erupted from the altar, piercing the bruised sky. The siege of light had begun, and the fanatics who had hidden in the shadows for centuries were finally being dragged into the sun. The dust of the siege had barely settled when the sun rose over the northern territories, casting a pale gold light over the ruins of the altar. The Eclipse sect was no more. Their dark crystal had shattered into harmless dust, and High Priest Valerius had been left a babbling shell of a man, his mind unable to withstand the Guardian's light. In the center of the royal palace, the atmosphere had shifted from one of terror to one of profound reverence. Debra sat upon the throne, not as a consort or a prize, but as the sovereign anchor. Beside her, the guardian wolf lay in its massive shadow form, its violet eyes watching the court with a calm, predatory intelligence. King Jayden stood at the base of the dais. He wore no crown today, only a simple tunic that showed the healed skin where the curse had once lived. He turned to face the gathered alphas, the Council of Elders, and even Kala, who stood trembling in the back of the hall. "The age of the Alpha as a tyrant is over," Jayden's voice rang out, steady and clear. "We were proud, we were arrogant. We believed that strength was found in the sharpness of our teeth and the submission of the weak. We were wrong." He turned back to Debra, sinking to one knee. The anchor has shown us that our strength comes from the spirit we protect. I have dissolved the council. From this day forward, the pacts will be governed by the laws of the light. Debra stood. Her presence still hummed with a trace of the divine, but her smile was entirely her own. She looked at Calla, whose eyes were wide with a fear of retribution. "Calla!" Debra called out. The hall went silent. "You spent 19 years making me scrub floors because you feared I was nothing. Today, you will begin your own service. You will work in the infirmaries, tending to the wounded rogues and the omegas you once stepped on. You will learn the value of the lives you discarded." As the guards led the weeping Beta away, Debra turned her gaze to Jayden. She reached down and took his hand, pulling him up to stand beside her. The spirit threads between them were no longer frayed. They were woven into a brilliant, unbreakable cord of violet and gold. "You bowed to a ghost, Jayden," she whispered, her voice warm. "But you fought for a woman." "I would fight for eternity if it meant standing by your side," he replied, his thumb grazing her knuckles. The story of the scullery maid and the Alpha King would be told for generations. They would speak of the day the earth shook and the stars fell, but mostly they would speak of the Omega who carried a god in her shadow, and the king who was brave enough to kneel before her. As the two looked out over their kingdom, the guardian wolf let out a long, melodic howl that echoed across the mountains, a song of peace for a world that had finally found its heart.